Okay, my clock says it is straight up 12 noon. And those of you who know, I am a killer for punctuality. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team monthly webinar series. It continues today with Dr. Richard Stup, Director of the Agriculture Workforce Development Program at Cornell University. I remind everyone that questions can be typed into the chat box and we will address the ones that Dr. Stoop didn't get to during the program at the end of the presentation. Please note that this presentation is recorded and archived on the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy webpage. And finally, please take 2 minutes to complete the evaluation after the program. The link will be provided in the chat box. Developing and retaining a reliable farm workforce has become one of the most limiting factors for dairy farm success. In this presentation, Dr. Stoop will explore some long-term demographic and economic trends affecting the farm workforce, current trends driving change, and the ways that farms are adapting now and for the future. We also explore workforce programs such as TN visas, the H-2A guest worker program, and how these impact the dairy industry. Finally, he will include a look at the future farm workforce. Dr. Stoop leads the Agricultural Workforce Development Program at Cornell. He teaches leadership and management, plus conducts research into labor challenges facing the industry. His focus is on helping agricultural employees avoid labor risk, create engaged employee teams, and operate profitably. He leads a team of 8 professionals and staff who focus on helping employers with regulatory compliance, developing managers and supervisors, employee housing management, and developing the future farm workforce. Before joining Cornell, he practiced as an organization development consultant, served as a senior leader in farm credit, and was an extension associate with Penn State and worked in the feed industry. He earned his doctorate from Penn State in the field of workforce education and development. As I always say, Dr. Stoop, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you, Fred. I appreciate it. And I'm really glad to be with all of you today. A little bit of my contact information. Glad if we don't get to something today, if anyone wants to reach out, please feel free to grab my email there. And of course, you can check out our website as well. Happy to follow up in whatever way is helpful. I really enjoy talking about this topic, kind of trying to get us out of the box a little bit in terms of how we think about the workforce both now and into the future. But I'm trying to look into the future, and we do that in our program. We say we have three pieces to the Cornell Ag Workforce Development Program. One is regulatory and regulatory compliance, and of course that's always a challenge, both federal and state. Then there's leadership and management development. We do a lot of that, including online courses. But the third one, and often the challenging one, is workforce development. And I always frame that in a simple way, and that is, where is my workforce coming from 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road? And then the other questions flow out from that. What will their skills need to be, and so forth? And so it's always a challenge looking into the future in that way because there's a lot of variables and a lot of unknowns, but I still think it's worthwhile to try to do so. So let's jump into it. Whoops. My clicker's a little hasty here this morning. There we go. Um, yeah, just a couple of key messages we'll get into. Uh, we'll take a little bit of a look back, look at some demographic and social change that's going to happen. It's baked in already. Take a look at some of the visa programs that are available right now. And we'll talk a little bit about policy reform. And I think that's so important for all of us to be asking and talking and emphasizing policy reform. We'll talk about that some more. Take a look at automation and AI, and then we'll also touch base on what I call supervisory leadership. So the leadership that we need on our farms in order to create great places to work. So that's kind of the agenda for today. Yeah, so I just wanted to share that we've been looking at this for a long time at Cornell in terms of labor and labor efficiency. This is something from Dr. George Warren, who basically invented ag economics, and all the way back in, I didn't put the, oh yeah, there it is, 1916. He was already looking at average man equivalents. He was looking at labor efficiency, and interesting, also looking at horse efficiency in 1916. So, and various sizes of farms. So it's interesting just to see how these questions that we're dealing with definitely aren't new. People have been looking at them for a long time. A few farm workforce trends that I think it's always helpful to kind of frame up where we are. This is USDA data. And unfortunately, they only collected this type of data up through 2000, but it still helps us kind of frame up the situation. So in the yellow bars here, topped by the smaller orange bar, the yellow bars are family farm workers, and the orange is hired farm workers. And you can see as the years went by in the second half of the 20th century that hired farm workers became relatively more important as the number of family farm workers declined. They're still important family farm workers, of course, but hired farm workers have really come on and become much more important to the industry. But I always like to pair this slide with another slide here, and I have to move some things around on my screen. Bear with me so I can see what I'm looking at. Okay, so this slide is labor productivity based on hours worked. So over really a similar time period, a little bit longer, um, the productivity of American farms has grown phenomenally, whereas the number of man hours put into that productivity has become far less over that period of time. So there's fewer people, of course, working in agriculture than there were back in the middle of the 20th century, but those few people are much more productive in terms of the things that they produce than what their forebears were. Population change is another thing to look at, and the key take home from this is just a census map between the years 2010 and 2020, looking at the county level. And so you can look at the colors, and the way this works is that the pink counties experience population decline, and the darker pink that is, the more decline in actual numbers occurred there. And then the green is the growth counties. And you can see, at least during that time period, the depopulation of rural counties and the growth of urban or metro counties. And you can see that across the country. I happen to be here in New York, and if you look at New York, a lot of folks might be surprised at how much pink there is. New York has lost a lot of population. But then I look out across, the Midwest and see lots and lots of counties that are in that situation. And we were just talking about it before the program started, but there's Iowa. And right in the middle of the state, we have, I believe that's the Des Moines area, and we've got a little bit of growth, but everything else has a relatively light pink, but a declining area. So what that means is that there are fewer people in those rural counties to recruit from to turn into employees at your farm operation. So while that story has been going on, while we've had this decline in those rural populations, we've also had immigration coming into the country over the years. Now, I started my career in the mid 90s. My background is dairy, and we're going to focus mostly on dairy here today. But in that time period since the mid 90s, a big factor that has influenced our workforce is the influx of immigrants from other countries. Now, of course, that's that has affected all sectors of agriculture in the U.S. And frankly, if you go to other developed countries, there are immigrants coming from other less developed countries into those developed countries to work in agriculture. This story repeats all over the world. But back to our focus here in the U.S., a lot of the immigration into U.S. agriculture came from the Southwest, from Mexico and Guatemala primarily. We don't have a real direct way to measure those numbers, but one of the things that we can look at is what's called total Southwest border activity. And these are numbers that the federal government collects from Border Patrol and field operations. And it's a way to have a proxy of how many people might be entering the country. So when you look at this table in front of you, there's multiple bars up there, and the years, the orange bar all the way on the top is 2022, and then the 2023 is the gray bar. 2024 is the kind of a middle orange bar. I'm afraid they're a little bit hard to tell apart. But the one that's the lowest, that is 2025. And you can see that since January of this year, when we had the change in the presidential administration, that the number of people border encounters went to a number very close to zero. That's essentially a closed border. Now, this is what I'm looking at here is adults, families, and unaccompanied minors. So it's everybody from all countries that were encountered at the border. But that's not who comes to work in agriculture. A few years ago, you saw the groups of people coming up from Haiti, and you saw people coming from Venezuela and all these other places. And it's true that there were lots of people coming to the border seeking asylum during the Biden administration. A lot of that has changed in this administration, but what about those folks from Mexico and Guatemala? And typically not families, but single adults. Those of us that have been in the industry a while know that that is the population that has primarily come into agriculture over the years. And so we can actually focus a little bit, and I'll go to the next slide, which is similar data, similar years here. It's just that I'm focusing on single adults and immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala. So a similar story here to show that group has also declined to near zero in the past year. So kind of the bottom line from these two slides is that there's really little to no new immigration coming into the country, even in this group, which I call the economic border activity of the people that often supplied agriculture over the years. This group has gone to near zero. So we need to think about our workforce in the country being pretty static, if not even declining, given the fact that with increased enforcement, there are actual deportations by the government, and there may be some self-deportation going on as people just choose to leave the country. So let's dig into some of the demographics that lie behind this as well. So we can look at data from Mexico, and this is the fertility rate in Mexico. So getting an idea about the population and what some of the demand might be to cross into the U.S. looking for jobs. So back in the 1960s, the fertility rate, which is just the number of births per woman in the country, was up at almost 7 births per woman. If you flash forward over those several decades up into 2020, it had declined to less than 2. Now, the population replacement rate for a country is actually about 2.1. So Mexico has now gone below the population replacement rate. This is classical for a country that has moved from a developing status into a more developed status. And really, in a lot of ways, Mexico economically has made a lot of gains and has approached becoming classified as a developed country. Now, they've got some other problems going on down there for sure, but some of these demographics have moved in that direction. Let's share another look at some similar type of data. This is called a population pyramid. And you can look at a snapshot of a population. So in this case, the left side graph is 2000. The right side is the year 2022. And we're again looking at Mexico. The blue side of these pyramids is male individuals. The pink side or red side, whatever that color is female. And the way it works is that each of the sections, as you start at the bottom of this pyramid, about 5.9% of the population back in 2000 was children aged 0 to 4. And then the one above that, the 5.9 and 5.7 for the male and female, was children 5 to 9. So you can see how that kind of is slices of the population as it goes up through ages. So then flash forward to 2022 on the right side of your screen, you see that this population has started to stabilize. When you have a wide base population, that means it's growing rapidly because there's lots of children being born. When you have a narrow base population, pyramid, that means the population has stabilized. And you see that actually the children are a smaller number at the bottom than what some of the older children and teenagers are. So Mexico is changing, and there just aren't as many kids being born, and there won't in the future be as much demand to leave the country and seek work elsewhere. Here's another factor we can look at, and this is gross domestic product per capita in Mexico. Now, this chart goes from the 60s up through the early 2020s, and this graph, it's important to know that inflation is not involved here. This is inflation corrected dollars, and the dollar standard used is 2010 US dollar. So they were really at $4,000 back in the 1960s in 2010 US dollars. And flash forward here to the 2020s, they're up over $10,000 per capita. So that's real growth. That's not just inflation, that's real growth and what has happened there. And so when we've got more income per worker, we've got more to spend. We've probably got more economic activity going on. We've got more jobs going on. NAFTA occurred back in 1994, right about the middle of the screen, and you can see the growth in Mexico after that period of time. It's pretty clear. So Mexico has grown. There's more economic activity there. There's more jobs there. There's less push to leave Mexico and seek work in the United States than there was back in the 1990s and early 2000s. Now, a Mexican worker can still earn about 7 times as much here in the U.S. as they would back home in Mexico, typically. But it's still that gap is narrowing, and there's more opportunity in Mexico. So let's talk a little bit then about this group of people that have come into the U.S., many of whom are working in the dairy industry and other parts of agriculture. Fruit and vegetable industry has the H-2A program, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But dairy doesn't have as much access to H-2A. And so we have had unauthorized immigrants, people who have crossed the border without a proper visa. They all typically have documents. And I always use the word unauthorized intentionally because that's actually the official word. Is a person authorized or not authorized? I always view undocumented as more of a political term, kind of a political term for the left, whereas illegal or illegal immigrant is typically a political term for the right. So I always stick to unauthorized, which is actually the appropriate term. But the Pew Research Center has been tracking this over time, and they have some ways of estimating the number of people that are in the country in this unauthorized status. But one of the things I wanted to show you here is the number of people who are long-term residents who are unauthorized. So this is only as recent as 2017, but even at that time, like 60%, 66% of the population had been here more than 10 years. And again, those of us that have worked in the industry for years, we know that it's a lot of the same people that started to work on those farms 20 years ago that are still there. And it's not uncommon to go onto those farms and find people that have been there 15, 20, even 25 years working on those farms. And so that population, unfortunately, has aged right along with the rest of us. And so that's another factor to be aware of is that even our immigrant population is aging, and over time is going to begin to age out of our workforce as well. In fact, here's another way to look at that. This one surprised me. I came across this data just a year or so ago, but the average age of the foreign-born farm employee is increasing. So the average age of the farm-born farm worker is over 42 years there in 2022. And actually, the U.S. born farm workers were lower on average. So just some interesting data that came out of USDA on that. Well, so we've talked about demographics. We've talked about immigration and unauthorized immigration. We should also talk about wages some. And here is a look at farm wages compared to non-farm wages. This chart is used a lot. In some ways, I think it's appropriate, and other ways, it's not entirely appropriate. But essentially, the blue bar is the average wage for non-supervisory farm workers. So you see that is lower than the orange bar. The orange bar that over the years is definitely higher, and that is non-farm wages also for non-supervisory workers. And that gray bar that runs along the top, that's actually the percentage that the farm wage makes up of the non-farm wage. So you can see all the way over at 2023, we were about 60% of the non-farm wage. And it's okay. I mean, it does tell it's an accurate story that farm wages are lower than the non-farm wage. However, I would encourage you to look at the fine print down below. It's not very fine. You should be able to read that. It's important whenever you look at this data to understand what it actually means and where it comes from, because things about the farm workforce can be quite confusing, and I see the data misused a lot of times. But on this graph, when you look at the details, understand that the non-farm workforce that they're talking about includes things like mining, logging, manufacturing, construction, and I'm okay with those comparisons. I think that's fair to compare those industries to agriculture. But it also includes the service providing industries. Now, I'm fine comparing agriculture to things like retail. In fact, agriculture usually beats retail when it comes to wages. But service providing also includes other industries like healthcare, like accounting, like legal services. And I don't think that's quite a fair comparison to put farm workers against nurses and accountants and other skilled professions like that. It's just not apples to apples at this point. It's not really a fair comparison. But for what it's worth, that's where we are. We've been gaining in agriculture in terms of wages on the rest of the economy, the rest of the workforce, but we're still only about 60% of those wages. Okay, so we've taken a bit of a look back. Let's turn our attention to some of the workforce opportunities and solutions that might be available. And I think it's important to start with the H-2A program. I know a lot of the folks on here have more of a dairy background, and so I wanted to start in this way and share some of the basics. If we're talking with the fruit and vegetable industry, they're already all quite familiar with H-2A. But H-2A is the Agricultural Guest Worker Program administered by the federal government with the support of the states. There's no cap on H-2A. There's no limit on the number of workers who could theoretically come into the country. You have to be an ag employer. You have to be in the U.S. The job you're offering has to be at least 35 hours a week. Growers or farmers can apply. Farm labor contractors can apply. And also associations or groups of farmers can get together and apply. The work needs to be temporary or seasonal, normally 10 months or less. So that's the rule that often takes out dairy farms. So you typically can have a milker, you can have somebody that's doing, cow health type operations or feeding operations because that's year-round work. It's not temporary or seasonal. But you can have people that are driving truck for a crop operation on a dairy farm,
Too big?
and that's what we're seeing more and more of.
I don't know.
And just to share with everyone, the H2A program is a complex operation. I always like to put this slide up. This came from U.S. Department of Labor. It's a handy dandy chart for navigating your way through the process. This one's a few years old, but I still like to share this. That it is complicated, and when you get through the U.S. Department of Labor part of it, well, you're maybe a little more than halfway there. because you still have to deal with U.S. Customs and Immigration Services to get the actual visas. So there's a lot that goes into the H-2A process, and we always tell producers it's actually at least a 2, maybe 3 or 4 year learning curve to really be adept at using the H-2A program. And the other point I would make there, if you're thinking about H-2A and you're new to it, I encourage you, especially in the first couple of years, work with a consultant or an attorney or a company that does H-2A services. So H2A was never cheap. There's essentially a federal minimum wage called the adverse effect wage rate. And this is the old AWARE. It's old because it was earlier this year, earlier than a few weeks ago at this point. But it had gotten fairly high. And here in the Northeast, we were at 1883, out on the West Coast approaching $20, and actually in the middle of the country approaching $20. So it had gotten pretty high, and the rate at which it had gone up over the last several years was a big source of concern for employers. Well, there's been a lot of change just in the last few weeks. So there are some new lower AWAREs available for H2A. Still not cheap, I would make that point. But anyway, the U.S. Department of Labor recently released a new interim final rule, which did a lot of stuff. And I don't have the time to begin to talk through that, but there's been a bunch of webinars going on from other sources. And in fact, we're doing one on Wednesday, tomorrow, that gets into this a little bit more with Chris Schulte. But I just wanted to point out that's the source of this major change that has happened. And we also did an explainer there, so you can access that website to see the explainer about the AWARE methodology change. But essentially, here's the bottom line impact. The new AWARE has 2 skill levels. There's going to be a skill level 1 here, and there's a skill level 2, which I'll show you in just a moment. But skill level 1 is apparently going to be very much entry level, almost or no experience. We don't think most employees are going to end up in skill level 1. We'll think more of them will be in skill level 2, but that all remains to be seen. That's really being sorted out right now. So I really don't know how that's gonna shake out. But you can see how these numbers are quite different and lower from what I showed you earlier. Uh, so one thing I would point out in many states, and this chart does show it with the asterisks, that in many states, this skill level 1, this entry level AWARE wage could be below the state's minimum wage. So like here in New York, we have a minimum wage where this 1568 is going to be below that by January 1 of next year. And so you won't be able to pay skill level 1. The minimum wage will be what'll have to be paid because H2A requires the highest of either the AWARE or a state level minimum wage. So that's skill level 1, and here's skill level 2, which again, we think early on that there will be more workers coming in at skill level 2. And so this is, we're at 1635 in New York. I see there in Iowa, you would be at 1772. And so it's, lower than what the old AWARE was, but it's not as much lower. So again, all that's in flux, and we'll see. Folks are starting to put in their job orders now using these new wages. It's not just about wage when we talk about H2A costs. So those of you considering the program, there's several other things, and this comes straight off of the USDA website. There are some application fees there at the top, $100 or so, and then there's a table that explains some more. Various other fees that they get you for $100 per worker. You've got transportation. You have to pay for workers to come into the country and to go back home to their sending country. And that, of course, can vary whether it's by bus or by airplane. You've got other miscellaneous costs, and the big one really at the bottom is housing, and of course that's going to vary tremendously from one farm to another. But altogether, you're looking at probably $16,000 in costs to have a worker come into the country before you've paid $1 of hourly pay or salary. So H2A is not cheap, but it's reliable, and that's the reason why so many in the fruit and vegetable industry have gone in that direction. A couple of other obligations that's important to know about H2A. First, every employee coming in has what's called a three-quarters guarantee. And what that means that if you bring someone in on a contract and they start work, even if something happens um, where through no fault of their own, the work is not there. So in the crop situation, there's a crop failure of some kind, and there's just not as much work. The employer is still obligated to pay three-quarters of what that worker would have earned if they'd worked the whole contract. So that's an obligation the employer has that you need to be aware of. Transportation, I mentioned already, housing, which again can be quite an expense. Cooking and eating facilities have to be provided, or some employers provide 3 meals per day in place of cooking and eating facilities. If you provide cooking and eating facilities, the workers then can buy their own food. And then the last one, which is important but a little bit subtle, is that it's H-2A workers are obligated to offer employment to any qualified, able, willing, and available domestic worker. And usually that's fine. Usually there's not a big problem with that. Where it becomes a problem is if a domestic worker applies and essentially displaces an H-2A worker, and then that domestic worker ends up not working out. They work for you for a day or maybe a week, and then they leave. And then sometimes you're shorthanded because that H-2A worker was displaced. Looking at growth in the H-2A program, this breaks it out by state. And really, if you look in the kind of the middle of that of those bars as you go across, it's the orange and yellow and brown colored states. So those are mostly West Coast and Southeastern states. That's where the growth has really been in H-2A over the last 10 years. And what is happening there is that the availability of the migrant workforce, often the unauthorized migrant workforce, has declined. And the only replacement really is the H-2A program. And so that's why the H-2A program has grown so rapidly. We in New York have been participating in H-2A for a long time. But relative to some of those other states that have really grown rapidly, we're now a relatively small player. And the other way to break this out is by industry. And so you can see here the kind of a pinkish purple there at the bottom, and the blue is the vegetables and fruit and tree nut industry. And they're still by far the majority of the H-2A that's involved. Field crops in green. So that's increased way back in the day in the 90s. I went out west and worked on a field harvest crew for wheat harvest. But that doesn't happen so much anymore. A lot of H-2As come in and fill those jobs and operate those combines and trucks. Um, Greenhouse and nursery work is in orange. And then animal products. So that is a couple of animal products. There's some range herders that are certainly eligible for H-2A. It's a relatively small number, but other operations, including dairy farms, have increased their use of H-2A. And I would just point out, while that percentage hasn't changed much, it was 7% back in 2011 and up to 6% in 2023. The actual number has changed. It was 6,000 back there in 2011. It's over 21,000 in 2023. So that animal industry has definitely increased their participation in H-2A. And I wanted to dig into that in a little bit more depth. One of the things that's interesting about H-2A, when you apply, it's actually public record. All the information that you put into the system, it's called the flag system, to apply for H-2A workers becomes part of the public record, and we can go ahead and access that. In fact, I put the website at the bottom there, seasonaljobs.dol.gov, which helps to advertise, but it also shows all the jobs that are available. So I just pulled a couple of examples off of that public website. So this is a typical H-2A job. It happens to be in Boardman, Oregon, on a dairy. It's focused on trucking and field operations. So I just encourage you to look at that text a little bit on the right-hand side. So operate tractors, wagons, loaders, and other equipment to load and move waste from one location to another. Routine daily maintenance on commodity and waste tractors, trucks, and loaders used at the dairy. So really, that's dairy farm work. And interestingly, some of those things are starting to seem a little bit less less seasonal in nature. It's not so much just driving truck for corn silage or haylage harvest. Now we're looking at moving materials around and hauling manure and things like that. So that got approved. I'll give you another example. This is from a dairy farm here in Perry, New York, and there's quite a bit of livestock work that is in here. It says in the first paragraph there, first sentence, does not participate in milk production and no day-to-day feeding and breeding, but lots of other livestock care and moving hay and feed around. And in the middle talks about performing maintenance on water tanks and feedlot equipment. So producers are getting more creative, I'll say, and finding ways to qualify to get H-2A workers and to show that it is temporary or seasonal because that's a requirement. Here's another one, livestock focused H-2A job in Merrill, Wisconsin. Again, feeding livestock, inspecting livestock. So increased use of H-2A by the dairy group. So H-2A, we talked about that a lot. There's some other programs though, like TN visas for trained professionals from from Canada and Mexico. So this came out of the original NAFTA agreement among U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and it was a visa again for trained professionals. So what we typically see working in agriculture and dairies in particular are folks that have a degree, usually from Mexico, in veterinary medicine. And Mexico, a veterinary degree is a 4-year degree. It's much like just having a college degree here. So, but the profession has to qualify, has to be a NAFTA professional. You have to have a prearranged full or part-time job, and you have to have the qualifications to practice there. Um, Inside of the TN regulations for this type of visa, um, you see jobs such as veterinarian, agriculturalist, breeders, animal scientists, dairy scientists, soil scientists. So, those types of jobs, I would add agronomists, things like that can also qualify. Again, typically a bachelor's or veterinary degree. And we are increasingly certainly here in New York, we see it a lot across the Northeast. I know in the Midwest, we're seeing lots of TNs filling middle management roles on dairy farms, not as milkers and things like that, but filling some of these middle management types of roles that require some of those qualifications and decision-making types of positions. So that's an increasing part of the future farm workforce, I believe. I've got some data here on TN visas that are issued by year from 2013 to 2024. Unfortunately, I can't break out agriculture. I can break it out by Canada and Mexico, but this is just the total number, not broken out. You can see it was steadily increasing. Again, virtually everybody is from Mexico. There's hardly anybody coming in from Canada using a TN visa. We had a steady increase up through 2020 when we had COVID, knocked it back, and then a steady increase after that. I can't explain why 2024 is so much lower. I don't have the answer to that. I've updated that recently, and I don't have the answer yet. But I suspect it might be a number that might change as the data becomes more solid, perhaps. TN visas can stay up to 3 years, and then they can seek an extension after that. Spouses and families can come on that visa, but they are not permitted to work. They can study. Again, there's no cap on this. Um, I will say when I mentioned inconsistent approvals, I also copied an article there that Farm Bureau had done on this topic, but it varies. There are parts of the country that seem to understand agriculture and can see how these TN visas can be qualified. And then there are other consulates and crossings areas that are not as understanding of agriculture and are less likely to approve those. So again, I would direct you toward that article for a lot more detail on how that works. Okay, let's then look ahead at some other things that are happening. Of course, we'd be remiss by not talking a bit about increased border enforcement. By now, I hope you've gotten your I-9s in order, and are ready, that you've trained your office staff and frankly your whole staff for how to respond and deal with an audit or a raid situation. There's been a number of programs and webinars on that. You can go to our website and see a lot of that material if you need to. But I don't see enforcement going away. And so far, we've had discussions about changes that might happen to support agriculture, but we've seen no actual change. So we should consider policy reform and talk about that a little bit. And the point I try to make with every audience I get a chance to talk with is that yes, there's a lot going on when it comes to enforcement, and of course, ICE is in the news every single day. Now, I will say that anecdotally, from my experience here in the Northeast and from colleagues I've talked with in the Midwest, there has not been as much enforcement on farms as there could have been. Now, there have been some very high profile things that have happened. Certainly in California, that was a very high profile raid. There have been some other closely related agriculture businesses that were raided, and they're definitely in upstate New York. And I've been on the farm and talked with the farmer about it. There was a major raid on a large dairy in upstate New York, and that one got a lot of press. And there was actually some children taken into custody in that situation. But that really has been the exception. Most of the ICE visits on farms, at least I can speak for New York, has been ICE coming after individuals who had some involvement with the law and who were on a list. It hasn't been widespread raids to this point. So when we talk about, I'm encouraging folks to change the subject a little bit from the raids and focus on the fact that we need some policy reform. Oh, something happened to my slide here. These things are a little out of line there, but I'll just click them all. So the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2025 has been introduced in the last several Congresses. It has been reintroduced in the House. It has not passed in this House, but it would provide earned legalization for ag workers and 3-year visas. So that really has dairy and other year-round employers in mind. It would also open up the H-2A program to year-round employment. It's been introduced in the House in the current Congress. Come on, slides. It hasn't been taken up by the Senate. So there's conversations going on in Washington. Nothing, to my knowledge, has moved forward that far. There's others on this call, and there's others closer connected to DC that know more about where these things are at this time. But my key message here is that while reforms like this may not be perfect and it may involve some significant compromises, we need to move ahead. We need to find something, and we need to get some reform taking place because right now, with just enforcement, and then we have immigrant advocates who are fighting against enforcement, that's really not getting us anywhere. The policy background is still the same, and that policy isn't working for employers or employees. It isn't working for people more on the left or people more on the right. It's really not working for anybody, and it's been 40 years. 1986 was the last major immigration reform we had in this country, and it's time for us to really take this up and make some changes. I want to talk about automation for just a few minutes as we come closer to the end here. Automation is not new. We've been seeing it in so many ways in industries for a very long time. In the dairy industry, we've got robotics taking place. We've got robotic milkers. We've got robots that can feed, and robots that can feed calves. And it's amazing how fast some of these technologies are really coming along. And of course, there we have a fully automated carousel. And I've heard that there's some challenges with this carousel that that it doesn't work as well as the producers would like. But these are engineering questions, and given enough time and investment, they're going to solve that. They're going to be able to make carousels like this that really do milk cows efficiently and well. So the technology is there, and it's coming at a rapid pace. We've been doing some research in our team and looking at how this um, affects the workforce, and some of the things we found is it's not as much about the hardware; it's really more about the information. So farms are increasingly capturing better information, able to make better decisions based on it. And part of those decisions are how they allocate labor. And so when we have cow monitoring software that lets us know that, hey, instead of checking 10 cows today, we can check only 2 cows because the software is telling us what we need without actually examining those cows, that saves a lot of labor. But the question then is, what will the labor be like? That remains. Uh, One thing I will point out is that in other fields, right there, you see a picture of a McDonald's on the left. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I was amazed at how quickly the cashier position disappeared at McDonald's. It's not that everyone likes these kiosks, but they work and they're relatively cheap, and people have really quickly adapted to that. And I don't think the cashier is coming back anytime soon, as long as these kiosks work that well. So it is repetitive, less skilled, and sometimes heavy labor that is going to be replaced. Again, that poster shows how this process has been going on for a long time, seeking higher efficiency. So some of the harder, some of the dirtier jobs in agriculture are going to be replaced over time. When it comes to workforce development, in some ways, we're a little behind in agriculture. We need to be talking about what those future jobs look like. I've highlighted a couple of things here from like diesel mechanics to building trades to medical and other fields. Um, but workforce development is about finding a sufficient number of employees with the right skills and knowledge to meet that industry's needs. And so we need to keep working on understanding what those needs are going to be in the future, where those workers can possibly come from to fill our future needs, more so than what our past needs would be. So I think those dairy workers of the future, I think they're going to be focused on critical thinking, systems thinking. I think they're going to have to be data savvy. I mean, people are going to have to, provide cow side work like this picture shows for a long time. I don't see any robots doing that very soon. And people are going to have to use the data to make decisions, although the automation certainly helps with that. And they're also going to have to maintain that equipment and keep it up and running, which is hugely in demand. So those types of jobs, if I could find, I'm increasingly hearing about agronomists who are just not enough available for the farms in our region. But I've been hearing about maintenance people and mechanics, that sort of job for a long time. That's been short for a long time in agriculture. And so if we can attract more people into the jobs on our farms, um, and really show people how, we offer a good quality of life, we offer really legitimate career type jobs. We need to do a better job as an industry attracting people in that way, in order to get those higher skilled people. And I think it's going to be helpful as we use more technology. It's going to help to make those jobs more attractive and probably higher compensation. Another thing I'd like to point out is that leadership matters. And again, that's something that we work on all the time. This was a study from a few years ago that I wanted to point out. Michigan State was looking at, they really focused on 12 large dairy farms in the Midwest and Northeast. And what they found is that employees' intention to remain on the job, one of the findings was that a couple of things like, is it clear who your supervisor is? So clarity like that, and the quality of the relationship with the supervisor. So leadership really matters. And we've seen this in this study and in many other studies that focus on it. We teach what I call the performance triad. If you want to be effective at leadership in your operation, you got to be clear about expectations, what those are for employees. Wow, things are running slowly here today. You got to be clear about the training that you provide. You got to provide that training to help people advance and have the skills that they need to be effective. And then finally, you've got to provide effective feedback to employees about their performance to help them improve. So, as I wrap up here, where are my workers going to come from? I think there's going to be people who love animals for a long time, and we have to support and encourage that. There's going to be people who are immigrants at multiple skill levels, but we can attract people even from other countries to work in this industry. So that's going to be part of it. And of course, we need reform for many of those people. There's going to be balance seekers, those that like to have a balance of thinking and a combination of hands-on. There's going to be people advancing in your current workforce. You need to be thinking about that and be strategic about that. I think that over time, we're going to be able to attract people with these higher paying jobs, higher skilled jobs from more urban places, maybe reverse some of that population flow that we talked about earlier. I know here in New York, you can have a job, you can be a middle manager on a dairy farm in upstate New York and be earning between 70 and $120,000 and have a cost of living that is half of what you'd have closer to New York City. Idealists and agriculturalists, people that grew up in agriculture and want to be here for the long term. And I wanted to share that image there. That some of our Cornell students and actually another international group that we had with us working on farms and doing some diagnostics on farms. We teach supervisory leadership, so I just wanted to throw this up. Go to our website if you want information on this. But we'll be teaching in Spanish on staffing and organizing your team, and we'll be teaching employee development and training in English. That's starting here in a few days. But we welcome people from all over the country to join us in those supervisory leadership programs. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for whatever questions that we might have.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Stup. We appreciate the information. Uh, we're kind of down to a manageable number. Uh, people, you can type in your question if you prefer. If you prefer to unmute and ask a question directly, more than welcome to do that. I'll give just a second to see what pops. Okay, I'm going to start off with a question. As I listen to you, uh, I'm wondering, will we start seeing some part-time intentions growing instead of a full-time person? For instance, as a person who's getting close to that retirement age, will retirees start saying, I'm pretty healthy. I think I'd like to work with the calves, or I'd like to work with maintaining equipment on the dairy. Are we going to see that or not?
There's some factors that might point in that direction. So what I see is not so much with the cows. With the cows, it tends to be more, especially on larger dairies, it does tend to be full-time work, shift work, increasingly. But it's in the other things. It's in the cropping operations, equipment operation. There's a whole lot of farms that do rely on part-time work, seasonal work of people that maybe had retired and things like that, or maybe worked in other areas and don't want to work year round, but maybe would like to jump in there and operate truck for part of the year. So I think that is part of it. But that being said, there's always individuals out there, farms that are willing to be creative and willing to take advantage of and I don't mean that negatively, but to take advantage of people that want to work part-time, whether it might be students, if you happen to be near a place where there are students available, that's always been part of it. And there's always people that do that. Or sometimes it's people, and maybe it's moms that, have some children at home, or today dads that maybe have some children at home and aren't available to work full time. So that's always been part of the equation. And I think it will continue to be.
Very good. I always wait just a minute or two and see if anyone unmutes. Not
Don't,
seeing,
don't be shy.
not seeing anything. Um, you use the population pyramid, and very interesting. What does the U.S. population pyramid look like?
Yeah. Yeah, I do show that sometimes, but it is, if I'll try to make it appear on my hands, but it's basically has certainly a point at the top, but then it's kind of a middle group that is the baby boomers and a little bit of Gen X there after them. And then there's a little bit of a bump out with that Gen Y group because that's a larger group. But then at the bottom, it is distinctly pinched in at the bottom because the group of young people is definitely smaller. Anybody that's in especially a rural area knows that those high school graduating classes are a lot smaller now than they were 20 and 30 years ago.
Okay. One, I have one more question. Do you see differences in the children of natives and immigrants? And I asked that a couple of years ago. I had a dairyman who said, I just don't understand why the kids of my workers don't want to milk cows for me. And I thought that was hilarious. I couldn't laugh, but and are we seeing a, a shift there? Or does it make sense that they all go to the same school, they all play ball together? We wouldn't expect expectation differences.
You know, that is a long-term challenge for agriculture. Uh, there's lots of farm kids. I grew up on a dairy farm, and so I ended up working in various aspects of the industry for my career. Um, but um, I was not encouraged to come back to the home farm, for various reasons. I had some older brothers and things like that. And there's plenty of kids that are, more actively discouraged um, from working in agriculture because even some people within the industry don't view it as um, a good place to build a career. I think we've gotten better at that over time as farms have become more professional in nature, but we're not great at it yet. Um, I think that immigrants who've come into the country, that first generation, you know, often has limited education, often has speaks Spanish and has limited English skills. Although over the years, many of our immigrant employees have learned good English. But that second generation that were raised, at least for a significant part of their childhood here in the U.S., speaks perfect, fluent English, has had an education here in the U.S., and has a unlimited um, set of opportunities to go into. And so, if their parents, who were that first generation of immigrants, if they've had a good experience and they are pointing their children toward considering agriculture as a career, there's a chance that the second generation might come in and work in agriculture. But I'll have to say, it seems that more often than not, they pursue another opportunity. And they're no different at that point than anyone else in the population that was educated here and can pursue those other opportunities. So they're making a choice to not work in agriculture as their parents did. That's something that we as an industry need to be looking at and focusing on. Why do we lose so many people out of agriculture? How can we make it more attractive? It is a combination of showing career potential, career growth opportunities. It is having good leadership, like we talked about. People leave their manager, they don't necessarily leave the organization. And so we've got a lot of room to become better at managing people and leading people in our operations. We can make improvements, of course, in our compensation packages and things like that. So, um, I think the technology is going to help us with that. I think we'll have less of the really hard, dirty jobs in the future, and we'll have more of the skilled jobs, but still, we're going to have rewarding jobs in agriculture. And I hope we continue to work on that.
Kurt asks a question, what do you feel the political resistance is to year-round visa options for ag industry that rely on it?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? What are the political?
Yeah. What do you feel the political resistance is to a year-round visa option for ag industries that rely on immigrant labor?
Yeah, and again, I'm not a Washington type to really get into that. So I have to rely on what others that I'm connected with have told me coming out of Washington. Um, I think there's two aspects of that resistance to year-round or multi-year visas, and one is the labor movement here in the U.S. is concerned about having competition coming from foreign guest workers that are here multiple years in a row. And so, when you think about it, you can understand that and see that competition. There's a fear of what they would perceive as cheap foreign labor coming into the country. So that's part of it. And the other part of it, I think, would be those individuals that are resistant to any immigrants, to any um, non-native born Americans coming into the U.S. to work. And you certainly see that. There's an element of that. I think those are the two big factors of resistance to that. I think most folks in agriculture see the need and the opportunity, and I think most other business-oriented people would also see that.
Hey, Tom asks a question, and I will just read it directly. We'll have an adequate workforce in the future if we don't increase the immigrants coming into this country, or will technology reduce the number of employees needed in the future?
I think the latter part of that question is clear. Yes, technology will reduce the number of employees needed in the future. We're 5 to 10 years out in some areas. When you look in the fruit and vegetable industry, the apples are being picked by robots, but they're not as well picked and they're not as fast as people are. But again, those are engineering solutions that will happen given enough time. The challenge there is that they're terrifically expensive and it's going to increase farm consolidation by requiring some of that investment in technology to be competitive. Um, I think we'll always need some level of immigration, or at least for a long time, we'll need some level of immigration coming into the country, and it's just that those immigrants are going to be um, increasingly skilled. We're going to shift more from lower skill straight up labor to some labor, some decision making, higher skill as time goes by. We already see this in dairy. As these technologies have come in, it's changing how the labor is allocated, and that labor is being allocated smarter into more, higher value work than it used to be. And we're going to see this in the other industries as well.
Very good. I'll wait just a second if somebody else wants to either type in a question or unmute and ask it. And while we're waiting, thank you, Dr. Stup, for sharing this information and for your insights. I'd like to remind everybody that this program has been recorded and will be available on the Iowa State University Dairy Team website. Give us 5 to 7 days to get it up and into the archive. And in addition, I'll remind you that in, excuse me, we will have the evaluation link is in the chat box there. Uh, we'd sure like to have you give us your insights. That helps make these webinars better every month. I'm not
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.
very good. Well, I'm not seeing questions, so I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we'll look forward to having you at next month's webinar, and I will sign this webinar off.